In football, promotion is usually seen as the beginning of a struggle. A smaller club reaches the top division, celebrates for a few weeks, and then spends an entire season trying to survive against teams with more money, more exercise, and better players. This is how the system is supposed to work. And when FC Thun returns to the Swiss Super League, nobody expected anything different. Just 1 year earlier, they had been playing in the second division of Swiss football, far away from the titles, far away from European football, and far away from the idea of becoming champions. Most people expecting them to fight near the bottom of the table, to survive if they were lucky, to eventually return to where they came from. Instead, something completely different happened. Week after week, FC Thun kept winning games they were not supposed to win. They kept finding ways to stay near the top of the table even when everyone expected the momentum to disappear. But it didn't. Because slowly, almost impossibly, the idea that once sounded ridiculous started becoming real. The newly promoted club from a small town in the Swiss mountains was becoming the best team in the country. And that is what makes this story so difficult to process. Because this isn't a club built to dominate Swiss football, it is a club that, not so long ago, was simply trying to survive. Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of FC Thun. This video is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell premium football shirt mystery boxes with real stories. If you want to discover your own story, you can use code TRIVINIO10 at checkout. There are football clubs that feel connected to major cities. And then there are clubs like FC Thun, a team surrounded not by skyscrapers or massive stadiums, but by mountains. The town of Thun sits near the Alps, surrounded by lakes, small streets and landscapes that feel almost disconnected from the pressure and noise of modern football. And the club reflects that environment. Nothing about FC Thun feels excessive. The stadium is modest, the budget is limited, and the expectations have always been small. For years, the club existed as something familiar in Swiss football. Competitive at times, difficult to play against, but rarely considered powerful enough to truly challenge the biggest teams in the world. And maybe that is why the story feels so unusual now. Because clubs like Thun are not supposed to dominate leagues, they are supposed to produce a few memorable moments, survive for a while, and eventually fade back into the background. But FC Thun has always carried something that statistics struggle to measure, a sense of identity. The feeling that the club belonged to the people around it, rather than an industry built around growth and visibility. And for a long time, that identity was enough. Until football started becoming more demanding, more expensive, more difficult to survive in. And eventually, FC Thun found itself moving in the wrong direction. Success in modern football is very fragile. One bad season can create problems, a few bad decisions can create instability, and for smaller clubs, instability quickly becomes dangerous. Over time, FC Thun began to feel that pressure. The club struggled financially, resources became more limited, and the gap between Thun and the biggest Swiss clubs started growing larger every single year. Eventually, the decline reached the pitch itself. The results worsened, the moment disappeared, and after years of trying to stay competitive, FC Thun were relegated to the second division. For many clubs, relegation is painful, but for smaller clubs it can become existential. Because once the money disappears and the attention fades, returning becomes incredibly difficult. And that is what made FC Thun's situation feel so uncertain. The club was no longer part of the highest level of Swiss football, it was no longer part of the national conversation, so slowly FC Thun began to disappear from relevance. And maybe that should have been the end of the story. A small club returning to the level people expected it to belong to, But football rarely moves in straight lines, and sometimes the moments that look like endings become the beginning of something else entirely. The promotion back to the Swiss Super League should have felt like a victory, and in many ways it actually did. After years outside the top division, FC Thun had finally found its way back. The celebrations were emotional, the relief was visible. But beneath that excitement there was another feeling too: realism. Because promotion is one thing, staying there is another thing. Most people looked at FC Thun and saw a team that would struggle immediately. The budget was still small, the squad lacked the depth of bigger clubs, and compared to the teams they were about to face, they simply didn't look powerful enough. The expectation was simple: just fight against the relegation, try to survive this season, and hope for the other seasons. And honestly, that expectation made sense. Nothing about FC Thun suggested a title challenge, nothing about them looked extraordinary, but football has a strange relation with belief. Because sometimes a team starts winning before anyone understands why. And once that happens, momentum becomes difficult to stop. At first, FC Thun's form felt temporary. A promoted club playing without the pressure, a few good results, a strong beginning that would eventually slow down. But the slowdown just never came. Instead, FC Thun kept growing into the season. Matches that looked difficult suddenly became manageable, games they were expected to lose turned into victories, and slowly the atmosphere around the club began to change. People stopped asking how long this run would last, they started asking whether it might actually be real. Because by the middle of the season, FC Thun were no longer a surprise near the top of the table, they were leading it. And what made it even more strange was the way they did it. It was not a club dominating through money or superstar players. There was no overwhelming squad depth, no financial advantage, just organization, confidence, and momentum. And perhaps most importantly, a team that never seemed afraid of the moment. While bigger clubs carried pressure, FC Thun carried belief. And week after week, they refused to disappear. The newly promoted side from the Swiss mountains kept moving forward until eventually there was no denying it anymore. FC Thun were no longer chasing the title, they became the champions of the Swiss Super League. When the final whistle arrived, the reaction felt bigger than celebration. It felt like disbelief. Because FC Thun had just achieved something that almost never happens in modern football. A newly promoted team had just become the champions of Switzerland. Not after years of rebuilding, not after a massive investment, but immediately. One season after playing in the second division, for the players it was historic, for the supporters emotional, but for the rest of Swiss football it felt almost unreal. Because clubs like FC Thun are not supposed to win titles, they are supposed to compete, to survive and to occasionally surprise a bigger team. But becoming champions changed everything. Suddenly, the small club from the mountains is no longer just a good story, it becomes part of the Champions League conversation. And maybe that is the most beautiful part of this. Because 20 years after their unforgettable European nights, FC Thun are once again preparing for the biggest stage in football. Not because they followed the normal path, but because they created a season nobody thought was possible. Modern football likes predictability. The richest clubs usually win, the biggest budgets usually survive, and promoted teams are usually reminded how difficult the top level is. FC Thun ignored all of that. A club from a small town in the mountains, a team that has spent the previous season in the second division, and now they are champions of Switzerland. It is the kind of story that feels impossible in modern football, and maybe that is exactly why people love it. Because every once in a while, football still gives us something unexpected. A reminder that structure does not always decide everything, that momentum can become belief, that even the smallest clubs can still create history. Not forever, not consistently, but for one unforgettable season, and sometimes that's enough. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you want to discover more clubs with identity, history and soul, make sure to subscribe, because somewhere out there another story is already waiting.